Shadowrun is one of the denser role-playing games, even after some of the cuts they made in Sixth World. Even at 300 pages, it can be overwhelming, especially since Shadowrun doesn't have the same kinds of trappings of a fantasy game like Dungeons & Dragons that a GM can rely on. There's good news in both cases though. You don't necessarily need to use everything presented, and Shadowrun is the same world as ours, albeit somewhat grimier and a lot more dysfunctional. Today I'm going to be giving some advice for would-be GMs of Shadowrun. This is stuff that'll help regardless of if you're playing 6th edition, 5th edition, Anarchy, and it might even help with some of the other Cyberpunk games. Now, a lot of this information is going to be a repeat of the Shadowrun 5e GM advice, since despite the rules changes, Shadowrun remains mostly the same game. And Shadowrun is a game where the GM has to consider 3 different worlds all at once. The physical world, the cyber world, known in Shadowrun as the Matrix, and the spirit world, known as the Astral Realm. At first blush, this makes it seem like the mandatory party requires a mage and a decker to deal with these 2 extra worlds. However, tabletop role-playing games are nothing if not modular. Just because the game has such features doesn't necessarily mean you're required to make them an integral part of the game. For example, in a party of nothing but street samurai or other characters only concerned with the physical world, Matrix and Astral Realm shenanigans can just be taken care of off-screen with little fanfare by NPCs. And with that in mind, you as the GM only need to concern yourself with the basics of magic in the Matrix. In other words, it's a matter of only being concerned with the stuff that your players are using. The same advice that I give for Tenra Bancho Zero. While I'm sure there may be Shadowrun veterans who may complain that cutting things out of the game that players aren't using also cuts integral parts of the Shadowrun experience out, for novice Shadowrun GMs, don't feel like you need to include absolutely everything. If you want to restrict things to just the core book or a particular set of books, then by all means, set those restrictions. Sorting through numerous books can be overwhelming. Thus, the idea is ultimately to ease yourself into the game. If your players want to play a mage or a decker, don't stop them, but at the same time, don't feel like you need to include every possible facet of that subsystem. Shadowrun is a game where players are playing as mercenary operatives of questionable legality, and anybody who's worked freelance will tell you, it's hard to get work if you don't know people and don't talk to people. Which is why NPCs are such a vital part of Shadowrun. They're the people getting in contact with your player characters about what jobs need doing. They're also vital to the Shadowrun experience. Shadowrun is wildly different from the flagship of tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons & Dragons, where the default assumption of D&D is you find a dungeon, crawl through it, kill any baddies in there, and take anything not bolted down. Shadowrun's base assumption is more about lateral thinking. Your fixer comes to you with a job where you'll be stealing a prototype device and all the data that company has on it. Your fixer may or may not know about that company, because the person paying may not have or want to disclose that information. So it comes down to you to fill in any gaps in what they tell you. In other words, the game flow of Shadowrun is get a job, do the legwork for the job, make preparations, complete the job, collect your payment. While a job in Shadowrun can possibly equate to one session, you could easily spread these steps over multiple sessions, such as making the legwork and investigation into the job its own session. And one way to facilitate this legwork, NPCs, specifically contacts. Contacts are something every character in Shadowrun starts with, and they are very much worth utilizing. If there's vital information that the PCs should know about a run, dispense it to them through their contacts. The contacts could either have done a job earlier at the location where the players will be at, and could thus provide information, or they may know somebody on the inside of that place that can make some arrangements for the players. And if you need further plot hooks, the contact could come back around with a favor they need doing later on. The key is to find some way that contacts can be useful in a given situation. Just because a player's only contact is a pipsqueak who lets them stay at their place every so often, doesn't mean that contact can't know other people who also tend to walk all over them. And those people may be more useful, if requiring a little bit more persuasion to be helpful. It could just as easily be that Mousy Master happens to be letting somebody else crash on his couch for a few days, and that person happens to be a decker by the name of Nullpoint that needs a new fixer after his last one overdosed on Nova Coke. And with that, you have just introduced an NPC who could handle all the Matrix actions the PCs will need to take care of for the next few sessions. There's two important things to consider about any Cyberpunk setting, and Shadowrun is no exception. First, Cyberpunk is about how technology is used to make our lives worse. This is one of the easier to notice themes, such as a constant arms race of trying to get the latest and greatest tech to keep an edge on the rest of the world, even when it isn't actually necessary or even helpful. This kind of keeping up with the Joneses mentality can quickly lead somebody to financial or some other kind of ruin. The second is that Cyberpunk also features a prominent theme of how corporations consolidate power, with one method being to use this new technology. The other is a bit more abstract though, and it's about what power structures corporations imply, which are also ever-changing. And thus, it's important to understand how corporations work. What corporations are is simple enough. A group of people working together towards a common business goal. And ideally, corporate leadership enacts policies that are ideal for business operations, bringing the most value to the customers, doing what's best for the communities they operate within, and turning a profit. However, Cyberpunk is not about the ideal, so I want to impart onto you some key things to keep in mind about American corporatism. The most obvious is that the final point is often the only thing emphasized: make a profit. And the blind pursuit of profit is what makes corporations, and by extension the communities they operate in, dysfunctional. Most importantly, you can use these dysfunctions to work in plot points or patch up plot holes. One of the ideals of American corporatism is the corporate ladder, the meritocratic belief that all a person has to do is prove they excel in service to the company, and they'll work their way up the ranks to a better life. The reality, though, is that there's not enough room for advancement for this to work for everybody, because without people to perform revenue-generating tasks, a business will be very hard-pressed to profit. So it stands to reason that only so many people will ever advance to leadership positions that take them away from those tasks. This creates what is known as the tournament model, where the best performers are said to reap the most rewards. And the tournament model is not just limited to employees vying for better paying leadership positions. It's also commonly used among sales forces. A company may hire more people than needed to meet the market demands of a territory, thus creating a competitive environment among their own salespeople. They'll set an aggressive sales quota for all their salespeople, a sales quota that they may or may not be able to meet, and with that, they have just engineered an environment where the sales force is going to have a high turnover. Thus, very few people end up with tenure. The higher-ups never need to worry about living up to the ideal of advancing people after so many years. Rank and file simply doesn't stick around that long. Mix in a culture of personal accountability and being the master of your own fate, as well as a healthy disregard of rules, all of which are present in modern America, and you'll wind up with people who are okay with using less than ethical methods to meet these unrealistic quotas. After all, their fate is in their hands. They only have themselves to blame, even if what they did was agree to a job with a quota that is literally impossible to ethically meet. And, well, the results are all that matters. So there will be some salespeople that use things such as high-pressure sales tactics, dense contracts that are difficult for the layperson to understand, and explain these contracts with misleading but technically honest fast talk. Or they'll just straight up sabotage their coworkers so they can claim their sales. That last one is the perfect in for Shadowrunners. A salesman who's willing to play dirty to keep their position at the top, or desperate enough to hire help to engineer their lucky break. The book Freakonomics by Stephen J. Dubner and Stephen L. Levitt has a chapter about this very business model that's frequently used in both legal and illegal business enterprises today in the United States. I'll include a link for some further reading in the description if you want to know more. But how all this pertains to Shadowrun is as follows. In a futuristic dystopia, competition can be fierce in the corporate world, and people will do all manner of dastardly things from currying favor to those above them, sabotaging those around them, and manipulating those beneath them to get ahead. And sometimes they may need a little bit of extra legal help to do so. In a world like Shadowrun, where due process and law of the land have been replaced with corporate procedure and policy, people don't get in trouble for hiring mercenary operatives to wipe out competition. They instead get in trouble for making the company look bad by getting caught. Another power structure that companies love to use: decentralization and outsourcing. Decentralization and outsourcing are two business concepts that you can use to integrate some non-canon practices that a corporation may engage in Shadowrun. Outsourcing is the practice of a business getting rid of divisions, departments, and other practices that aren't central to their operation. For example, imagine a computer repair and custom building company that also takes unwanted computers and salvages them for parts. Then they either use those parts for building or repair, or selling secondhand. Outsourcing would be if they stop doing computer salvage and instead secure extra parts through some other means. A case could also be made for if they decided to stop working on repairing and building and just focusing on computer salvage and recycling. But usually the implication is that outsourcing removes a vital service that's necessary for the business's operation. The way that this comes into play in Shadowrun is as follows. If a corporation is known for using outsourcing, one method to break in could be to impersonate on-site contractors that are used for these outsourced tasks. And if you need a way to drop this idea onto your players, it could be advice from an NPC who used a similar tactic on their own run, like one of their contacts. The opposite of this concept is called vertical integration, where a company will build up the infrastructure to perform all the tasks related to its business, or they'll just buy up companies that do this work already. This practice isn't quite as common in our timeline. However, there is a related concept to that called horizontal integration. Horizontal integration has always been widely used, and fits in perfectly as a tool for corporate scumbaggery in your Cyberpunk games. Basically, horizontal integration is when a company buys up all its competitors or other companies that are in a similar market. The other companies may or may not be rebranded according to the acquisition. A video game store that gets bought out by a larger store may be required to change their name to the company that acquired it. Or a given brand could be allowed to continue to exist as it was, just owned by a different company. In fact, it's entirely possible that not much will change at all, making the acquired company a subsidiary. They're still their own company, but they just have to answer to a parent company now. And just to make things even more confusing, it's entirely possible for a subsidiary to have its own subsidiaries. Here is an image showing all the major consumer goods companies that operate within the United States. Many of them are subsidiaries, and there's ultimately about 10 holdings companies that own all of these subsidiaries. This parallels the Big 10 in Shadowrun, the most influential megacorporations in the Sixth World. Any smaller company likely belongs to them as a subsidiary, or a subsidiary of a subsidiary, or a subsidiary of a subsidiary of a well, you get the picture. It's a complicated mess, and like it or not, it's rooted in reality, since this is exactly what happens in our world. Though the good news is, in Shadowrun, If you want to take a few shortcuts by not memorizing what all the megacorps are and who owns what, you can just make all your corps many times removed subsidiaries of one of the Big Ten. And thanks to the confusing nature of outsourcing and integration, you can just crank up the absurdity in Shadowrun even further and just pick one of the Big Ten at random, even if it doesn't make sense for your company to be one of the subsidiaries of them. These can just be small fries that folks at the top aren't concerned about. It could have happened as a part of somebody's scheming or just a happy accident of some other acquisition or merger. And the strange mix-up is too insignificant to really warrant being fixed immediately. So to sum everything up that I've said, you don't need to know everything, just the stuff for what your players are going to be playing. Why learn how to use the magic system if you have no mages in your game? NPCs, use them. Even the big dumb meathead that just shoots and stabs people probably has friends that also just shoot and stab. And that friend has probably heard things too. Or at least did things a while away from their mutually dreck-headed friend. And finally, branding and business organization creates a giant headache to navigate through. And this can be used to obfuscate countless things in the business world. After all, very few people in the United States, political pundits especially, seem to realize there's only 10 food companies. Why would anybody in the fictional world be so knowledgeable about who really owns what brand? Thanks for watching. If you found this video useful or entertaining, give me a thumbs up like. And if you want to know more about Shadowrun or even just other RPGs in general, check out some of my other videos or hit subscribe. And with all that said, I am Arondero, and I will see you all next time.